Hi there, my name is Rory Swantek, and this is my presentation on the history of cookbooks within Western civilization. So, I specifically chose this topic to be my focus because I believe that food is something that really encapsulates the entirety of the culture. Food explains the technology, the agriculture, and also the social aspects of a civilization. So that's why I specifically decided to focus on food and specifically within that, the history of cookbooks. The earliest written cookbook is an ancient Grecian book called Mythicus. Mythicus was written around 500 BC by a man who shares his name with the title. It was a small collection of recipes, many of which do not have credits given to who created them. Many of the recipes have been lost to time, but there are still some that remain. There is one notable recipe featured that isn't too far off from modern Sicilian cooking. And this is a recipe for a specially prepared fish. So, when preparing the fish, you will cover it with olive oil and cheese and then bake until it is cooked thoroughly. So, not very specific directions are given, of course. That is to be expected with a cookbook or a recipe that is so old. So, this recipe in specific is actually really significant because it does display a lot of the cultural aspects of the time, specifically location and technology. So, again, the recipe itself is not very advanced or anything like that, which is complementary to the technological situation of the time. And also, the location properly displays what would be accessible. So it was written off of the coast of Sparta, and so it is to be expected that the recipe would feature a fish. It's a pescatarian dish. So the environment heavily affected the consumption as well. Following Mythicus is a Roman cookbook called Apicius. It was written around 400 AD in Rome. It features 499 recipes featuring various interesting meats that are very exotic in comparison to today's diet. So, this includes turtle doves, conger eels, and other exotic meats. And so, this has fortunately been well documented and been thoroughly reviewed and examined by historians. So, the recipe that I am preparing from this book is called With Poached Eggs. So, I am just following the recipe as best as I could, but specifically, I wanted to touch on the exotic meats featured within this. So, because the Roman Empire was so vast, it is no surprise that there was a lot of exotic meats that were featured, especially because uh, in the Colosseum, it was very popular to have displays where hundreds of exotic animals would be murdered. So, there was a heavy focus on the exotic animals at the time because the Roman Empire was so vast. Here's what my roommate had to say about the recipe.
It's not bad.
All right.
It's like
Maybe
average.
maybe the Romans had something going on.
The next cookbook was The Form of Curry, or in modern English, The Form of Cooking. This is the oldest cookbook in English. It was written in 1390 by the cooks for King Richard II and Queen Elizabeth I. There are many varieties of dishes within this book, some of what are similar to what we would eat today. And so the recipe that I have selected to prepare is Achiapitis. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, so let's say that I am. It requires that you boil garlic in a bit of oil and water until it's softened, and then when it's thoroughly cooked, you dress it in saffron, salt, and pepper. So this recipe actually reminds me a lot of something that I like to eat pretty regularly, which is garlic confit. So that's a oil preserved garlic. And so the preparation of this is very similar. So I found that that was very interesting that we're beginning to see comparisons to modern cooking, modern English cooking through this recipe. So The technology is also featured within this recipe, and it specifically tells you to put it on the stove, which I also found to be interesting as well, because we're beginning to see some of that modern technology advancing through this. Of course, it's, not a modern stove or the stove in the traditional sense, but the references to specific technology being used. I also think that it's an important point to point out that garlic specifically has a very long shelf life. And if you know anything about the environment of England, it does not have a very long growing season or a production of produce. So having items like garlic or other root vegetables that can withstand the cold, that can withstand the seasons and last for a long time on your shelf, it's very important. So a lot of these recipes feature items that can last for a very long time. The final cookbook was The English Housewife, which was written in 1623. This is the shortened title. Of course, I saved the best recipe for last, pancakes, although these were quite difficult, as previously mentioned, because measurements were not given and I was entirely reliant on instinct, or rather trial and error, to create these. I followed the recipe to the best of my ability. Again, not given any instruction as to measurements or anything like that. But specifically, I wanted to mention that there was a lot more variety in the ingredients provided, especially with spices. Spices I found were very heavily featured within this cookbook. So that really is showing you the cultural diffusion that had happened at around this time as well. So a lot of spice trade, a lot of international exploring as well. So the discovery of the Americas had occurred and the colonization of the Americas was beginning to happen. So that is important to mention. And so, specifically, I found that this recipe really, really displayed the entering into what we would consider modern cooking, because the recipe itself tasted like a regular pancake that I would enjoy today. And I think that it's beginning to reflect on the technological advancements as well as the social expectations for food. So it's interesting to see what would be considered a fancy expensive dish from the beginning, with the fish dish prepared in olive oil and cheese, to the modern dish, which is very common and simplistic in its nature. And again, this recipe book was compiled for the average English housewife, recipes that anybody could really make. And so, another thing to mention was the invention of the printing press really had a astronomical impact on popularity. This is one of the most popular cookbooks to ever exist because of how many people were able to access it. So I just wanted to take note of that. Overall, I think that by learning the diets of those in the past, we can understand their daily lives just a little bit better. Food speaks of the land as well as the culture, and each of these recipes display this. The first shows the access to the coast, and so with this, fishing, of course, would come with that. I also think that it's important that even though most of the other recipes were lost, the main recipe that continued to survive and continued to have reference made to it was the dish about the fish. And so I think that it's important to take note of that. The next recipe book was Apicius's recipe book. And so this one threw me for a little bit of a loop initially because of the exotic meats that were featured. But when you take into account that the Roman Empire was so vast, it makes perfect sense. It also makes sense that specifically when you take into account the mass killings of these exotic animals in the Colosseum, that it would be not uncommon to eat them as well, of course. And so I think that that's important to take into account. The next was the form of curry, and this was the first English cookbook and one of the most famous cookbooks in history. And I found myself finding a connection to this one specifically because I found that the recipe was very similar to something that I eat very regularly today. So we're beginning to see that development of the English culture and the modern sort of idea in which we view food. The final recipe book that was featured was The English Housewife. And so this dish, even though there weren't any measurements necessarily, was very similar again to something that would be enjoyed today. And I found that to be very interesting as well, especially because of the spices, again, with the cultural diffusion and the spice trade being so prominent, a prominent part of society. It makes perfect sense. History is meant to be enjoyed, and what better way than through food? Although it can be challenging to read the Old English of texts like Form of Curry and The English Housewife, once deciphered, it does not feel uncomfortable to make, less for some ingredients, of course, that are not as popular today. Overall, I think that, again, reflecting on the food of the past can really tell you a lot about society at the time, the culture at the time, the agricultural state of the time, and the technology. It's very important to look at the past and reflect it onto the future. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I hope that you enjoyed it, and hopefully you yourself will be able to make some historical recipes. Have a good one. Bye-bye.